Ladies and gentlemen, we are here with a different type of video. I was browsing the tubes and I saw something that really caught my eye. I'm really I won't say I'm big into geopolitics, but it's interesting just to see what people do. And I saw something that really would make people question this man's sanity. So, without further ado, let's take a look.
A Russian court has handed down a judgment against Google, but only Putin would be delusional enough to claim more money than the world can supply. The penalty demanded is currently about $20 decillion, or to put...
Pause. Decillion? Excuse me? We gotta check this out.
Put that in simpler terms, about 20 billion trillion. Yeah, you heard that right. For those who have never heard of such a large sum of money, a decillion dollars is a number followed by 33 zeros. The ridiculous sum is currently the largest penalty to ever be given in legal history.
Where on God's green earth did this man think?
And it seems a little senseless considering the limited Google assets in Russia right now. For starters, Google does not even have the financial capacity to pay this penalty, considering the fact that its market value is around $2 trillion US, which is practically nothing next to what it's expected to cough up. For another perspective on this foolishness, this fine is 75.96 trillion times Elon Musk's net worth, infinitely more than Russia's own GDP, which was $8 trillion in 2023. So why is Russia coming for Google? And is this judgment even enforceable? As sanctions are starting to get the better of Moscow, it seems Putin's desperation to raise funds has skyrocketed. There's a lot of politics behind sharing content like this. We are constantly fighting Putin's bots under our videos. These tactics push our content back and make it harder for us to reach our expected goal. To help us, please, like our videos and share them too. We really appreciate it. What we need to remember throughout this video is that this is all retaliation. As Russia continues to be pushed into a corner by the Western response to its invasion of Ukraine, it needs to get creative on how it's going to raise money to fund its war machine. The court case against Google started all the way back in 2020 when YouTube blocked Tsargrad TV from its site after the US imposed sanctions. YouTube also
against Google started all the way back in 2020. Blocked Tsargrad TV from its site after the US imposed sanctions. YouTube also...
I remember that. Google, it wasn't just Google, it was a bunch of other companies too that backed out of Russia once the sanctions hit, and they weren't in support of the war, of the invasion of Ukraine, so
banned about 17 other channels, including Zvezda, Channel 1, Parliamentary Television, Moscow Media, and TV Center.
Russian economy.
Tsargrad TV is well known for its strong pro-Kremlin stance, and as tensions began to rise between Russia and the West, Russian channels began to face restrictions. After this case went to court, it was decided that Google needed to pay a penalty of $1,200, about 100,000 rubles, per day for the restrictions it had placed. And this amount would double every 24 hours if Google did not remove the restrictions. Google chose to ignore this court order, and the cumulative effect of the fine has reached today's ridiculous figure.
They're definitely not paying that.
Russia has dedicated a lot of time and energy to litigating media companies because it understands how they affect its propaganda machine. Another court case was brought in 2021 over an illegal content breach when a Moscow court fined Google $98 million, about 7.2 billion rubles, for repeated failure to delete content deemed illegal in Russia. The supposed illegal content was
$98 million, about 7.2 billion rubles, for repeated failure to delete content deemed illegal in Russia. The supposed illegal content...
But here's the thing. YouTube has been hands-off with that for years now. The only time they're actually going to delete content is when it breaks the company TOS, or it breaks copyright and it's requested to be removed by a copyright holder.
Was
Outside
really
of
anything
that,
that was not pro-Putin
YouTube
or
ain't
the government.
touching
That would include
content.
this channel and this video
Like,
you are watching
they're
right now.
completely hands off outside
In
of
this
that.
year, Russian authorities were working
clearly
hard
anything
to silence
pro-
tech companies, claiming that they were not moderating their
This channel
content
and
and it was
this
interfering
video
with the
we're
country's
watching
internal
right now.
affairs.
In this year,
Hours after the
Russian
Google
authorities
verdict was
were
announced,
hard
a
to silence tech
$20.5 million,
claiming that
about
they were
2
not
billion
moderating
ruble
their
fine was
content
handed to
and it
Meta,
was interfering with
the
the
parent
country's
company of
internal
Facebook.
affairs.
And Twitter was
Hours
also
after
handed a
Google announced
$30,848
That's why I shut up
fine,
the Google
a
over
3
there.
million ruble fine
Fines in
for
Meta.
similar charges. The
Facebook.
major target in all of
Twitter
these
was
fines and restrictions was Putin's star opponent, Alex Navalny. The country's media regulator had blocked dozens of websites linked to his campaign groups, labeling them extremist, and it wanted all these other social media sites to follow suit. Google and
media
Apple
regulator had blocked dozens of websites with campaign groups, labeling them extremist. It wanted all these other social media sites to follow suit. Google.
Yeah, see, what Putin failed to realize is that these big tech companies aren't gonna do that. Like,
Apple were also
that
forced to
kills
remove
their
an app
I won't say
dedicated to
kills their bottom line,
Navalny's
but it
smart
affects
voting
their bottom
campaign,
line.
which gave users advice on
They're
tactical voting to
definitely not gonna
unseat
do that.
Kremlin-aligned politicians.
Were also
Other
forced
sites like LinkedIn and Dailymotion were also blocked for refusing to cooperate with authorities, and 6 major providers of virtual private networks were banned too. In response, Google told AFP news agency that it would study the court ruling before deciding on further steps.
of course they were.
Putin's regime has been obsessed with developing a sovereign
Of course.
internet, which gives the government more control over what its citizens can access.
Deciding on further steps. Putin's regime has been obsessed with developing a sovereign internet. It gives the government more control over what its citizens can access.
So China has something similar to that. I believe it's called the intranet, where it's all like localized internet ISPs.
When
I guess
2022
that would
came
be the right
around and Russia
terminology.
invaded Ukraine,
And
Google escalated the tension by
they
shutting
monitor
down its
everything
Russian
that goes
division.
in and everything
The
that
company
goes
also
out.
closed its Google AdSense in Russia over the summer, meaning local content creators
Google escalated the tension by shutting down its Russian division.
would
The
no
company
longer
also
be able
closed
to
its
receive
Google AdSense
monetization.
in Russia over the summer.
Although Google and its YouTube
Content
services have remained
See?
accessible to
See, what I
Russians,
tell you, they
the legal
took that
battles have
joint
only
away.
gotten wilder.
no longer being
In August of this year, The
monetization.
Telegraph reported that Moscow
Google
seized
and
more
its
than
users
$100 million from
accessible
Google's
to
bankruptcy
Russians,
entity
the
to help
legal
fund the
battle
war in Ukraine.
wild.
According to the court
In August of
documents,
this year,
Google
The
said
Telegraph
Russia
reported that
handed
Moscow
some of its
seized more
assets
than
to
$100
sanctioned TV
million
channels like
from
Tsargrad,
Google's bankruptcy
who
entity
took the money and
to
put it
help
directly
fund
into the
war
war
in
effort.
According
Google
to
has
the
also made it clear
documents,
that the initial
Google
money
said
due
Russia
under the
handed
judgment
some of its
was
assets to
$12.5 million,
sanctioned
meaning
Tsargrad,
Russia seized
who
more
took
than
the
it
money
should
and put it
have.
directly into the war
After seeing that Google
course
was
they
not
did.
taking it seriously,
initial money
Russia
due
decided to
under the
reinforce
judgment
its
was
bogus
$12.5
judgment from
million.
2020.
Russia seized
The
more
current
than
figure
it
that we're
should have.
talking about now is an
After
accrual
seeing that
from the
Google
judgment
was not
passed when Russia's
seriously,
courts
Russia
first
decided
ordered
to
Google to
reinforce
restore
its
the YouTube
bogus
channels it had
judgment.
closed. Kremlin spokesperson
The
Dmitry
current figure that we're
Peskov
talking about
commented
now
on the
is an
charge,
accrual from the
stating that
judgment
he
passed
can't even
Russia's
pronounce
courts
this figure
first
right,
ordered it
but
to
said the
restore
figure
the
is
channels
filled
they
with
closed.
symbolism.
Kremlin
The
spokesperson
message that
Dmitry
the Kremlin
Peskov
is trying to
commented
send with
on
this
the charge,
penalty
stating
is that
he
Google
can't
should
even
not be
pronounce this
restricting the
figure right,
actions of our
but that the figure
broadcasters
is
on its
filled with
platform or
symbolism.
participating in
The
sanctions
message
against
that
the state.
Kremlin is trying to send
Google's
with
response to
penalty
this has
is
been
that
the same as
Google
its
should
response
not be
to most of
restricting
these cases:
broadcasters,
indifference.
but
When CNN tried to
or
get a comment from them,
participating in
they
sanctions
stated
against
that they
the
were
state.
still looking into legal
Its
matters.
response to this
In a
has been
statement,
the
Google
same as
said,
its response to both.
civil judgments that include compounding
They
penalties
don't
have been
care.
imposed upon us in
Comment from
connection
them,
with
they
disputes
stated that
regarding
they were
the
still
termination of
looking into
accounts, including those of
In a
sanctioned
statement, Google
parties.
said,
We do not
civil
believe these
judgments that
ongoing
include
legal matters will have a
penalties
material
have been
adverse
imposed
effect
upon
on
us in
earnings.
connection with disputes
In
regarding
other
the
words,
termination of
Google is
accounts,
refusing
including
to
those of
acknowledge
sanctioned
Russia's
parties.
wild
We do not believe these ongoing legal matters will have a material adverse effect on earnings.
Yeah.
Acknowledge Russia's violent.
In short,
goose
They don't
chase for
care.
money. Months after the 2022
don't.
invasion, Google's Russia
They
subsidiary
don't
filed
give
for
a
bankruptcy and
fuck.
paused most of its commercial operations after the
chase
government
your
seized
money.
control of its bank
Months
accounts.
after the
According to a
invasion,
company representative,
Google's
the company's
Russia
debts
subsidiary filed
exceeded
bankruptcy and
$195
paused most of
million,
its commercial
or 19
operations
billion
after the
rubles,
government seized
while its
control of
assets were
bank-
$36 million,
Yeah.
about 3.5 billion
Representative,
rubles.
The company's
These continued
I would
litigations are pointless,
Million dollars
considering the fact that in
billion
November of
dollars.
2023,
its
the
assets
court
were
officially
$30
declared
million,
Google
but
bankrupt.
$3.5 billion.
Now that Google has closed its
These
operations in
continued
Russia,
litigations are
these
pointless,
courts do not have the
considering the fact
jurisdiction
that
to
in
enforce
November
this
of
judgment. This is because they do not
officially
have the
declared
capacity
Google
to seize assets from
Now that Google has
outside
closed
of
its
Russia's
operations in
borders.
Russia, These courts do
Losing
not have the
Google has been
jurisdiction
about so much more than
judge.
getting a couple of
This is
channels
because they
closed
do not
down.
have the capacity
To the
seize
Kremlin,
assets
Google is
from
just another
outside
blow to its economic
borders.
stability that it claimed
Losing
would not
Google has been
crumble
about
under
so much more than
sanctions.
getting a couple of
The loss
channels
of business
closed
from a
down.
company as big as
To the
Google
Kremlin,
had a
Google has
devastating
put
impact
another
on
blow
Russia,
to its economic
but it was not the
stability
only
that it
company to
claimed
walk
would
out of the country
crumble under
in
sanctions.
2022.
The loss of
Now,
business from a
recently
company
we have
as big
crossed
as
1
Google had a
million
devastating
subscribers.
impact on Russia.
Ever since then, we've been
course it
flooded
would.
with emails asking us
Walk out of the
questions and
country
advice
in
about growing a
2022.
YouTube channel. Boot camp by
Now,
clicking on the
recently
link in the
we've crossed
description
1
to invade
million
Ukraine.
subscribers.
After
Ever since
receiving
then, we've been flooded with emails
Putin made the
asking
bad
questions
of
and advice
Russia,
about growing a
let's
YouTube
get back to the
channel.
video.
Boot camp by clicking on the link in the
Multinational
description.
companies from every
Invade
single
Ukraine.
industry pulled out of
After
Russia
receiving-
as soon as Putin made the
Putin
bad
made the
decision
end
to
of
invade
Russia.
Ukraine.
Let's get back to
After
the
receiving a lot of backlash
video.
for not
Companies
halting its
from
business,
every single industry pulled out of Russia as soon as Putin made the bad decision to invade Ukraine.
See what I tell y'all. Did not tell y'all.
in Russia,
when they,
immediately,
invaded Ukraine,
McDonald's,
those
one of the
companies
biggest
pulled
fast
out.
food chains in the world, said goodbye
and
to its
that
Russian market.
decimated the economy.
Конечно, потому что привык.
It's sad, of course, because I'm already used to eating my favorite ice cream, which I came here for today. But basically, when something new is coming, it's only natural. So we'll wait and see. Maybe it'll be even better.
Поживем, увидим, вдруг будет лучше.
It won't.
McDonald's initially arrived in Russia in 1990 and quickly became a fast food staple for the Russian people. The opening of McDonald's first restaurant in Moscow was symbolic, as it showed that the Cold War tensions were
Wait, who was that? Hold on. What are those? Is that Disney? Those are Disney characters.
McDonald's first restaurant in Moscow was symbolic, as it showed that the Cold War tensions were thawing. Almost a year after this, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia began to open up its economy to companies from the West. More than 3 decades later, however, it was one of the first corporations to pull out. After 2022, the company began to cite the unpredictable business environment and the humanitarian crisis as its reasons for choosing to close down business. In March of 2022, it started by temporarily closing down 850 outlets. But after that, things became permanent when it started to sell its restaurants. This process is known as de-arcing, and it basically involves McDonald's retaking its name, branding, and menu and selling its sites to local buyers. The effect of this decision
That's actually very smart. That way, McDonald's doesn't lose out on all the money they invested into the Russian market. They essentially in this, like if I was to have a business, I could just sell off instead of completely shutting down and leaving. I just sell off all my business and all of its assets to somebody else, and bada bing, bada boom.
has had dire consequences on the employment market in Russia because about 62,000 employees were employed in these chains. The danger was that if the local buyers who purchased the chain did not wish to keep them on, they would be left stranded.
Yep.
To cover its exit, McDonald's wrote up a charge of $1.4 billion, and in a message to staff and suppliers, McDonald's chief executive Chris Kempczinski said, "This is a complicated issue that's without precedent and with profound consequences. Some might argue that providing access to food and continuing to employ tens of thousands of ordinary citizens is surely the right thing to do. But it is impossible to ignore the humanitarian crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. And it is impossible to imagine the golden arches representing the same hope and promise that led us to enter the Russian market." Many people were devastated by the closing. But let us take, for instance, this man. He was recorded making a last-ditch
Hold up. Why does man look like a whole bowling ball? I know that's bad, but Jesus. Wow. So, I feel like I could just push him and he would just roll. Like he just snowball. That's hilarious.
attempt to prevent the McDonald's outlet from closing down when he chained himself to the door of the store and exclaimed, "Closing down is an act of hostility against me and my fellow citizens." After a lot of fighting, he was dragged away by the police, who ended his protest. Less enthusiastic people elsewhere simply scrambled to the branches and savored the burgers for the last time. Some customers reportedly hoarded the meals, and then when the franchise closed down, they sold them online for prices equivalent to the average monthly salary of Russians.
Wait. Oh. didn't know McDonald's was that popular. Wow. These people sniped burgers and then upsold them. McDonald's burgers and meals. Why? It can't be that good. It can't be. There's no way. Like, I've had McDonald's in other countries before. And yes, it's a lot better than it is here in the States. So much better. But that... I'm not seeing it. I'm not drawing the connections here. I'm just not. It can't be that good. Ain't no way.
Culturally and economically, the exit of McDonald's was a large shift that the country has still not recovered from to this day. Shortly after McDonald's, the coffee giant Starbucks followed suit. In May of 2022, Starbucks exited the Russian market, marking the end of its presence in Russia since 2007. The country had opened about 130 stores operated by its licensee, Al-Shaya Group. This approach is uniquely different from how other countries chose to run their businesses in Russia. Unlike franchises like McDonald's, Starbucks did not actively operate its cafes in Russia. What it did was sell its rights through a licensing deal to partners. These partners, in turn, hired about 2,000 employees across the country. At first, Starbucks eased into its exit by suspending services and stopping shipments of its products to the country.
That makes a lot of sense. So they didn't operate their own stores directly. They just sold the license for Starbucks to Russian citizens in companies. That makes a lot more sense.
Country. Then, when it saw other Western countries taking a bold stance, it followed suit. For 6 months after the departure of Starbucks, employees still took home their salaries as assistance for them to transition to other working opportunities. Starbucks also took a very bold stance by Ukraine, and in a statement to its partners, it wrote, "First, we will donate any royalties we receive from our business operations in Russia to humanitarian relief efforts for Ukraine. Second, the Starbucks Foundation has contributed $500,000 to World Central Kitchen and the Red Cross for humanitarian relief efforts for Ukraine. And third, our EMEA business will continue to work in the market to support people in need through additional financial contributions and services. As this dynamic situation continues to unfold, we will listen and take additional steps to support all our partners and communities. We will let you know as we have more to share." The choice to leave Russia was made for most of the major companies. Shareholders refused to stand behind the generation of profit in Russia, and the companies began to feel the hit when their share prices began to plummet drastically. Because of the global opinion on Russia's actions, investment stopped, and even other major food companies like Nestle, Mondelez, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever had to halt business to avoid losing share values.
That definitely makes sense, because with the entire world pretty much in support of Ukraine, had they stayed in Russia, it would have inadvertently showed support to Russia, and people would have pulled their stocks. Whew. Talk about money moves, man.
While we would like to pretend that it was all about social responsibility, the decision for a lot of companies to leave Russia was political, especially with Zelensky appealing to multinationals to stop doing business with the devil. Let's take Renault, for example. In an address to the French parliament, Ukrainian President Zelensky made a point to single out 3 companies, Renault, Auchan, and Leroy Merlin, who he accused of sponsoring the Russian war machine. He even went as far as to say that the French car maker was financing the murder of children and women and rape by choosing to forget its values and worry more about profits. Earlier on in the week before Zelensky's address, Ukraine's...
That's harsh. That is harsh. But probably true. Probably true.
Foreign minister had called for a global boycott of Renault products, given its decision to stay in the Russian market. The decision was a little more difficult for Renault to make, considering what was at stake. Companies like Volkswagen, Nissan, and Mercedes-Benz simply had to stop exporting to Russia, which was not as big of a hit for their markets. Things were different for Renault because Russia made up a tenth of its global revenue, while France owned a 15% stake in Renault. Renault was also in control of 68% of OUTRAGOUS, the largest car maker in Russia, which is the Renault Group's second largest market, with 500,000 vehicles sold in 2021. What Renault did was sell its shares in OUTRAGOUS with a 6-year option to buy back its stake. According to the Renault CEO, this was the most responsible decision because it would keep its 45,000 employees in business and give it an opportunity to return when the circumstances were better. For now, the Soviet-era Moskvich brand is going to take over, and it has already begun production of passenger cars. You would think that Russia taking over the manufacturing of cars would actually be a plus for the country, but the statistics show something different. According to the Association of European Businesses, the sales of new cars in Russia have dropped by 63% because Russian car makers AutoVAZ has been placed on the US's Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons list, the SDN list.
So this company took over Renault's business and then got slapped with sanctions, which killed 60% of their sales. Jesus Christ. Oh, Putin, he put a lot of people in bad positions.
This means that the cars that Russia is currently manufacturing can only be used in the country, as the sanctions on the business have been detrimental to the export of Russian vehicles to the global market.
And then on top of that, people aren't even in Russia, probably really aren't even buying new cars right now because the economy's been trashed so heavily. So they can't afford to buy new cars. Oh God.
In an attempt to save the business, AutoVAZ decided to relaunch production by partnering with Chinese companies to manufacture vehicles. Unfortunately, these partnerships are slowly breaking down because of these secondary sanctions that will be imported on Chinese companies that trade with sanctioned businesses. This means that Russian car-making businesses like AutoVAZ are going to be out of business soon. Instead of benefiting the manufacturing industry, this season has benefited the second-hand car market, which is booming with budget Ladas and Chinese cars selling better than premium brands. What is even sadder is that Russia cannot even turn to its closest ally, China, during this automotive crisis. The payment issues between Russia and China, caused by US sanctions, mean that Russian importers of Chinese cars have been losing out on big business. This has not been bad news for China, which is always looking for an opportunity to profit with misfortune. Beijing has taken over Russia's car market and begun to sell since companies like Nissan and Renault pulled out. This may be beneficial for China, but with no car production happening in Russia, Moscow is getting the short end of the deal. The reason a lot of businesses are opting out of working in Russia is the never-ending impact of sanctions on the market. With sanctions limiting forms of payment and the war creating huge uncertainty over future prices and consumer appetite, the business climate is not conducive for a lot of companies. Fashion retailers like H&M and Zara are also among the brands that have decided to diplomatically suspend their sales as they watch on for developments in the war. While the West did a good...
I mean, they're going to have to. Because if they don't, they're going to get grilled by the rest of the world and the rest of their market.
job impacting Russia's economy from different sectors, the strike on the oil sector was definitely a hit to the jugular. Russia's oil business used to be the largest supplier and the top oil producer globally. Now, because the US and Europe are hitting Russia with unprecedented sanctions, the oil companies that used to run in these countries were forced to cut ties with Russia as well. Britain's BP and Shell, and Norway's Equinor, have all shut down their operations in Russia. The oil giant BP had to exit and leave behind its $14 billion stake in Russian oil company Rosneft. According to BP chair Helge Lund, Russia's attack on Ukraine is an act of aggression that it cannot overlook. BP has operated in Russia for over 30 years, but it could no longer continue to work together with Rosneft, considering its political and military ties to the war. This is because Rosneft is chaired by Igor Sechin, the former deputy prime minister of Russia and a Putin ally. Back in 2014, the United States...
Another rock and a hard place. God, this war is like... Fuck.
Sanctioned Rosneft after Russia's annexation of Crimea. And since then, BP's involvement with the country has been controversial. The firm has pledged to no longer buy oil, but it states that the contracts it signed before the invasion of Ukraine will have to be fulfilled. It took some bullying, but Shell also got onto the bandwagon eventually. Shell was heavily criticized in March of 2022 when news came out that it bought Russian crude oil at a very low price after the war started. In anticipation of how badly Russia would be hit by sanctions, Shell took the opportunity to make a quick buck. The Ukrainian foreign minister took to social media to ask the question, "Doesn't Russian oil smell of Ukrainian blood for you?" In response to people's critiques about the company's greed, Shell apologized and immediately stopped buying oil from Russia. The company quit its joint ventures with Gazprom and also ended its involvement in
People are ruthless. People are absolutely ruthless. Oof.
in the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was supposed to be between Russia and Germany. As part of Shell's withdrawal plans, the company said it would offload a 27.5% stake in a Russian liquefied natural gas facility, a 50% stake in an oil field project in Siberia, and an energy joint venture. It also shut down about 500 service stations and halted its aviation fuel and lubricant operations in the country. In a bid to do damage control, the company stated that Shell has not renewed longer-term contracts for Russian oil and will only do so under explicit government direction. But we are legally obliged to take delivery of crude bought under contracts that were signed before the invasion. For years, these Western energy companies have been able to turn a blind eye and compromise with the Russian government as a part of the cost of doing business there. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything for them, and they could no longer continue on under the radar. The corporate reputation of a lot of these companies is extremely important, considering the fact that they have interests in other countries and their shareholders hold their own opinions. Putin's invasion is too much of a high-profile incident for companies to ignore, and this has led to most of them moving out. The problem for these companies and Russia is the fact that a lot of Russian firms facing sanctions don't have the resources to acquire these foreign investors' assets. This leaves private equity firms as the only potential investors as they face less scrutiny than publicly traded companies. The Russian energy sector is struggling because it depends heavily upon Western companies' technologies, especially for hard-to-recover oil projects and offshore projects. The big three, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil, will leave significant technological voids that are going to be impossible to fill. By the first quarter of 2024, Gazprom recorded its first annual loss in over 2 decades of nearly $7 billion. Due to being cut off in Europe, the plan was to move supply to Asia, but this did not work out due to the lack of infrastructure, as gas is mostly transported via pipeline. The cap on the sale of gas also means that Russia is selling way below the profit line. Pre-invasion, Russia was negotiating contracts of $350 to $380 per 1,000 cubic meters. But now it's fighting just to get $297 out of China. These low prices will mean more losses, and it does not help that China has other alternatives.
China finna get Putin. Xi Jinping is going to get Putin for everything that he has. He is. Because China is, the CCP is for China. And they will use other people to get for China if they have to.
Even if we wanted to, we would not be able to go through all the companies that left because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. According to the Yale School of Management, over 1,000 companies exited Russia since 2022. According to the Kyiv School of Economics Institute, as of September 2023, 300 international companies have permanently left Russia. Every sector has taken a hit, from aircraft services to the tech industry and production. Putin may try to pretend that there has been no impact at all, but this mass exodus has meant a lot of losses for the Russian economy, and it's unlikely that it will ever recover.
To be honest, there's no way you could fake that. For a country like Russia that is so dependent on everybody else, so I believe it's like 80% of their landmass like uninhabitable, or it's like you can't farm on it, which is why one of their biggest exports is oil. So to sit here and say that, oh, go away. Your sanctions mean nothing. These companies mean nothing. We're top dog still. We don't care. Ooh-wee. You can't pull that off. I don't care how good of a liar you are. There's no way a country was so heavily dependent on exports will survive if all the companies that are leading those exports and leading that economy pulls out. It's not going to happen at all.
Most impressive part of all of this is how effective the sanctions and global pressure have been in pushing Russia into a corner. Daniel Tannenbaum, the global head of sanctions at the consulting firm Oliver Wyndham, said, "Never before have we seen such a significant economy be subject to such comprehensive actions. And at the present pace, we're seeing Russia well on its way to being spoken of in the same breath as Cuba and Iran."
Ooh.
One of the major impacts we need to discuss is the hit to employment. We discussed it briefly when we talked about the employees who were laid off by companies like McDonald's and Starbucks, but let's take consulting firms as a case study. Accenture, a global management and technology company, discontinued its business in Russia and stated that it stood with Ukraine. As of March 3rd, over 2,300 employees lost their jobs, and all they received was a thank you for their dedication and service over the years. Another professional service giant, Deloitte, stopped its services.
Talk about a slap in the face. Like, that's just you done did all this work for us, and we're shutting down. But thank you for your work. Thank you. Thank you. Now go do something else. God. Jesus fucking Christ.
In both Russia and Belarus. It promised to assist its professionals as best it could, but 3,000 professionals were laid off as a result of their exit. Ernst & Young was not to be left behind, and it removed its Russian practices as well. The effect of this was that 4,700 professionals in 9 cities lost their jobs. Consulting and accounting firm KPMG International said that its Russia and Belarus firms will leave the KPMG network, and ended its working relationship with over 4,500 people. Although KPMG sympathized with its staff, it emphasized that the decision was not about them. Its focus was on the Russian government and making sure there were consequences for its actions. From the 4 companies that we discussed here, we are already looking at 14,500 personnel without jobs in just one sector. Foreign companies have become such an integral part of the Russian economy, and a lot of Russian people felt the effects of them leaving. All this litigation with Google and the mass exodus of other global household names is pointing to a bigger problem that we cannot escape, which is that Russia's economy is crumbling.
It is.
After the exit of these companies,
really
the ruble
is.
lost 1/3 of its value, and Russian inflation hit 15%, with the GDP falling by 5%.
Ouch.
Putin's brash move to invade Ukraine failed to account for the fact that Russia is actually heavily dependent on foreign investment from Western countries. According to an analysis by The Economist of bilateral data on stocks of long-term investments, boy, that was a mouthful, the Russian economy is more reliant on the West than it was a decade ago. About 30% of Russian imports came from G7 countries, and in some industries like chip making and computers, Russia remains wholly dependent on American parts. Things have gotten so bad that the cards of some Russian...
Did I not just say that? Well, not that in particular, but didn't I just say a country that is so dependent on exports and assistance from other countries? There's no way Putin could flex that hard and make everybody believe that they are okay. They're not.
Banks under sanctions no longer work with Apple Pay or Google Pay, which caused chaos on the Moscow metro in 2022 when they initially shut down.
No.
About 40% of Russia's GDP is in international reserves, and its short-term asset holdings are at an all-time high. Now, Russia probably thought that it could circumvent its problem because about 35% of its foreign currency was in gold and yuan. But with the recent issues with Chinese banks, Russia is in some serious hot soup.
So, for those who don't know what's happening with the Chinese banks right now, I believe this takes back to the whole real estate issue they had. And essentially, people were taking out loans and mortgages to purchase homes and purchase like these condos that were never getting built. Companies were basically selling property that didn't exist. And what happened was they would sell, like say, they would sell out all the units in a building. And instead of building that building or selling units to a building that was already built, they would take it and go buy the property and do the same thing again. And what was happening was years were going by and people were seeing no progress, and they stopped paying their mortgages. So all this money that the banks had paid out to these people to have homes, where they were now not getting back, and they were flustered. Like, then I think they're still recovering from that. If it's even been resolved yet, because it's just like, just think about it, that's billions of dollars that the banks have paid out in mortgages that they're not getting back.
At this point, Russia has been relying on the yuan. But with reports of the yuan liquidity deficit, things are definitely going south in Moscow. This deficit in the liquidity of the yuan has come because China has refused to be paid in rubles and will only receive the yuan as payment. This pushback against the ruble makes perfect sense because the value of the ruble is volatile on the global market, and China does not want to be left with money that it can't change.
Pretty much.
As the ruble continues to plunge, reports from September show that the ruble fell by almost 5% against the yuan. More data from the Moscow Stock Exchange, MOEX, predicts that the central bank's daily yuan sales will rise to $200 million.
Ooh.
As the situation gets out of hand, the central bank has its hands tied, because it cannot lend in yuan when it cannot cover its foreign currency position. A big part of the problem is also because financial sanctions have restricted the central bank from accessing a large portion of its foreign currency reserves held in international accounts. These reserves would have been used to stabilize the national currency, manage inflation, and finance government spending. By freezing these assets, the sanctions had the potential to significantly weaken Russia's financial stability and its ability to fund war expenditures, leading to economic instability. Due to these foreign currency shortages, Russian businesses have been forced to depend on yuan swap deals provided by the Bank of Russia, but these deals come at a ridiculously high cost. Swap deals are financial agreements between parties that are meant to help manage risk. In these deals, one party, in this case Russian businesses, pay a premium to the other party which compensates them for the risk of the financial transaction. In the first month of 2024, swap deals were being done at about 2.
Oh my God, I can already see the fallout from that. Wow. Oh my God.
4 billion yuan on average. And then in June, when the US increased its threats about secondary sanctions, there was a frightening jump to 10.3 billion yuan. August of 2024 reported the worst numbers, with the figure jumping to 20 billion. If this continues, Russia will not have enough currency to be able to make any of its payments.
Nope.
The situation is only going to get worse, as Russian businesses report that there have been growing delays in payments with Chinese trading partners, with billions of yuan being withheld for months on end. The squeeze of sanctions is getting to Russia's closet ally, and now Chinese state banks are closing transactions with Russia in mass numbers and withholding payments to them. Financial institutions in China that were previously making payments to and for Russia have been scrutinizing the transactions heavily. And now, payments that are flagged are being held back by Chinese state banks. This means that Russian businesses that make their money through oil and gas exports are suffering the most. The situation intensified in August, when Chinese state banks carried out a mass shutdown of Russian transactions worth billions of yuan. For a long time, Putin seemed to be convinced that he could keep the Russian economy afloat without the assistance of the outside world.
No.
His move into Ukraine was
not.
calculated from a point of pride, and with the belief that he would be able to swiftly conquer Ukraine and carry on with his expansion. When the sanctions started pouring in, Russia was left paralyzed and humbled instantly by how quickly everyone turned against them. As the war comes to an end, Russia is going to have to salvage its dying economy and its national image at the same time.
The year is 19...
Putin done fucked up. Putin done fucked up. This war, it ain't gonna do nothing but keep going downhill for them. No matter how many bodies they throw at the war, they ain't gonna come out of this. Unless Putin pulls out, they ain't gonna come out of this. And honestly, personally, I think Putin got too much pride. He got too much pride to pull out because he was big and bad and boastful when he started. So to pull out now, it ain't gonna be a good look. And that's what they care about. How it looks. Prayers out to Ukraine. Definitely. But prayers out to the Russian people. Because, man, y'all got it bad now. Y'all gonna have it worse soon. Whew. Well, that's the end of that. So, let me know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think down in the comment section. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.